Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of elements that I have noticed in a lot of books that I have picked up recently over the course of the last year, couple of years, that contribute to feeling like I am reading the same book over and over again. I'm obviously not referring to literally every single book I pick up. It's just that there are certain books I pick up where it feels so much like a carbon copy of something that I've already read, and I wanted to dissect what the elements were that are leading to this, because of course a lot of genres, not just within fantasy but so many, they have obvious inspirations and they go through trends and they go through cycles of tropes that get thrown in, it feels like, to everything that comes out, and it sometimes feels like it's inescapable. For example, we all know that we've gone through dragon phases, vampire crazes, and other sorts of things. Fantasy itself, especially adult fantasy, has definitely had this happen as well. In the past, I would say, and I don't think this is profound by any means, I think a lot of us would say this, that it was for a while stuck in feeling like it was too heavily relying on its Lord of the Rings inspiration. And as a result, a lot of classic fantasy, if you go back and read from certain eras, might feel similar to each other or might feel like it's Lord of the Rings. And it kind of took a while for it to branch out into other things. And of course, it's still going through its cycles. But I wanted to specifically today tap into why it feels as though fantasy romance, or just romances in fantasy, are all starting to sound the same. I know we've had conversations before about female characters in fantasy, male characters in fantasy, and just in books in general, and the kinds of tropes that we see over and over again, what we'd like to see more of. And I'll have those videos linked if you'd like to watch. But then we've also discussed things that irk us in fantasy romance, and also same thing, things we would like to see more of. And while those range from being big topics that a lot of us tend to agree upon to very specific minor things that for whatever reason maybe irk you individually, what I wanted to do today that's a little bit different is essentially create a reference point for myself, but then also maybe for you if you're a reviewer, or not that I want anybody to use my videos as writing advice, but if you yourself are a writer, maybe you can ask, like, am I falling into this a little bit? I wanted to go through 15 different elements that on their own, I don't necessarily think are bad to include. I don't think there's anything wrong with, and I've said this many times, having something that is on trend if you are doing something unique and interesting with it. If you have compelling characters, if you have a really amazing creative world, there's so much you can do with a story that's still maybe rooted in something familiar. That's not inherently bad. But it's when you have an abundance of these things, that's when things start to feel repetitive. For some people, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe you are looking for stuff that just fits within these bullet points. You're like, yep, this is what I like. So if you say that it fits within this, that's for me. But jumping into it, and the very first thing would be Fae. Every single time it feels like I do an anticipated releases video, and I do these monthly to keep you up to date on new releases, and it's a nice thing for myself to keep track. Pretty much every time there's at least one book that has Fae in it. And Fae come in all shapes and sizes, we'll say, in various different fantasy works. In some, they're extremely malicious, and they're more associated with folklore, they're more tied to the environment and the weather and the seasons. And then you have some where they're just hot people that live for a long time and have pointy ears. But that is the very obvious first point. The next one would be modern or colloquial language. I think a lot of us, I don't know what it is, but in our fantasy stories, we don't like when the characters talk like we talk. We want characters to feel like a reflection of real human beings. We just don't want them to talk like us. We say like all the time. We meander. We say, you know, at the ends of sentences. For what reason, I'm unsure. Maybe we all just kind of secretly need some validation to the points we're making. But regardless, we don't actually speak in a way that we want directly replicated in our works. However, I don't necessarily mean the opposite needs to happen, where everybody speaks in a really formal way that feels stunted. We don't need that. We just seem to like something that's in the middle. I think this is different if you have some kind of urban fantasy world. That makes sense that maybe they would speak a little bit more modern. But there is something odd that I can't quite determine why it's so prevalent in fantasy romance. I don't know if it's because maybe some fantasy romance readers are coming from romance, and that tends to be rooted in contemporary settings or our own world, and those people do tend in those books to talk more like how we talk, and thus if you have readers going from that into fantasy romance, the dialogue would still be similar. I don't quite know where this is coming from, but regardless, it just feels odd. It feels clashing to have worlds that don't feel particularly modern necessarily, yet we have the characters speaking the way we speak. Point 3. Moronically snarky main characters. What is going on? I don't mind the tough and gruff character. I don't mind the character with a chip on their shoulder. And I also recognize that a lot of books want to tap into female rage, that idea. But I also, I can't handle the characters that are a chip on their shoulder and also really stupid. Because if somebody is offering to help you, as an example, if there's a scene where you clearly cannot do something on your own and you need assistance, and another character comes into the picture and they're like, here, let me help you. And they're like, get away from me unless you want to die. You're in no position to do that. Why are you so dumb? Stop it. So it's that weird, I just want to kill everybody and slit everybody's throat, and I have some snarky comeback to every single thing that's said to me, and I'm feisty. Aren't I feisty? And isn't that kind of actually hot, though? And you're like, no, it's not. It's really not. I don't understand, because snarky characters can be fun. They can be really fun characters to have, or the character that always has a quip. Those can be fun characters to write, but when you combine them with idiocy, that's when it doesn't work. It doesn't, like, I need those characters to ask themselves, does it make any sense for me to act like this right now? Or to at least once question their behavior. Like, why am I so pissed off at the world all the time? Ask that question. And that will instantly endear me to that character, being like, oh, well, at least they're looking inward and asking why. But when they don't, and then everybody else seems to embolden that behavior and act like it's like, well, isn't that just how they are? You're like, no, please stop it. Point 4. Enemies to lovers. This is not also anything new. I really want to emphasize what I said at the beginning. None of these in isolation are bad, and a lot of these in combination are not bad. It's when it's almost all of these, which certain books you can probably go through this checklist and be like, yes, yeah, that too. Yep, it's got that too. A true enemies to lovers story can be extremely difficult to pull off, but when it is done well, it really taps into breaking down what separates us and then seeing the person on the other side. It doesn't even have to just be romantic. It can oftentimes be with friendships or just people seeing each other differently. And I think so many of us gravitate towards that idea, not necessarily with execution, but the idea, because our own world, we have so many stupid metaphorical walls between us and they're useless, and we have so much more in common with each other if we could just take those walls down. And so seeing that reflected in fiction can be really powerful. However, most of the time it's like somebody was mildly annoying on a first encounter, and then suddenly we hate them for eternity until we also recognize that for whatever reason we find them so hot. It's probably because of that perfectly chiseled jawline and really sharp cheekbones, and they're massive, and it's like, oh. Anyway, so that'll be my next point. But the idea that these characters are enemies when in actuality it's just we don't know how to write tension without writing them supposedly hating each other, it's getting old. And it would be so good if we actually did it really. I would love to know. I did a video where I took a lot of the things that you're frustrated with, and I talked about books that do those things in a way that I actually think a lot of us would like. But if you have your own recommendations for any of these points, really, feel free to leave those in the comments, because that way people who are like, yeah, I don't dislike that individual point, I just want to see it in a book in a way that's a little different, they'll have your recommendations. Getting into the next point, though. So there's a few that are similar. We have all lust, no love. Pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to elaborate too much on this, but it is a little bit irksome for me to pick up a book that is supposed to have an amazing fantasy world and a really beautiful love story, and all that happens is that the characters find each other hot. And if I wanted to watch good-looking people find each other good-looking, I would watch Too Hot to Handle, you know? I don't want that in a book where I'm supposed to watch these characters fall in love. You know what they love? They love having sex with each other. That's it. That's all it comes down to. And I'm like, that's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. And I will say it was really funny because the book that kind of sparked this, I read it around the same time as a book that is not fantasy romance. In fact, it's pretty much just fantasy. But there is a tiny, like the tiniest of tiny romantic subplots, and it is so cute. It's so cute. And I'll talk about that book in a future video. But oh my gosh, like I was so in love with the way in which these characters, like the one character, when they realize that they're falling for the other character, the actions that they take to show that they care is precious. And it had nothing to do with what the characters looked like. Nothing wrong with characters finding each other attractive. And also, I don't even care if characters initially are drawn to each other because of their looks. That is a thing that can happen. But it's when you have these characters confessing their undying love for each other, when they've never had anything about one another articulated that they actually like, either in the narrative or spoken aloud in dialogue, it doesn't make any sense. Next up, we have what I call doormats. This is just when love interests have no personality, they have no backbone. They are just there for the main character to walk all over and yet still be uplifted. When the love interest is basically a yes man, that's not a good love interest. And this goes the other direction too. We do have times where the female character is she just exists to be a curvy shape for the guy to be into, and she supports him no matter what, even though there's nothing between them. It goes in all different ways, you know. So, doormats, please stop. And then another extreme of this is the abusive love interest, where I'm like, I don't get it. We either want somebody that bends to our will completely and entirely, or we want somebody who doesn't allow us to be a human being with our own thoughts and opinions.
Speaks her mind?
Nah. So those are the extremes. And obviously it's rare that you're going to find a book with both of these in it. Can we have characters that are their own people? Something in the middle. Healthy relationships, nice relationships, or complicated ones, but the characters grow together. Something with a little more nuance and that's a little more dynamic. Okay, this next one is kind of specific, but I unfortunately see it all the time. And that's the way in which the characters constantly refer to each other as males or females. I understand that in the instance of Fae, the characters are more like tapping into this animal-like element to themselves or whatever. And thus, referring to each other as males and females is reflecting that. But it's getting old. I don't like when real humans talk about like, oh, that female over there or something, or like, well, you know how females are. And you're like, what? No, gross. And the same for men. You know, if women or other guys, I guess, are just talking about like, oh, well, you know how males are. It's weird. We're human beings, you know? Ladies, fellas, guys, gals, whatever, right? I don't understand why there's this hyperfixation on calling each other males and females unless it makes sense to the world building, which oftentimes it doesn't. It's just this next point I'm going to make. It's just because Sarah J. Maas did it. And the next point is it an overt Sarah J. Maas inspiration? And if so, it's probably not going to feel particularly original, and it might encompass a lot of the other things I've mentioned anyway. But there's more to the overt Sarah J. Maas inspiration than just Fae or males, females, and all those sorts of things. There are some books where the characters' arcs and their personalities and even the world to some degree is just the same thing. Like, you end up predicting what's going to happen if you know anything about Sarah J. Maas's books, because that's all that's happening in this book over here. It's just you slightly changed the setting, or you slightly changed the main character's hair color, or you gave the love interest a beard instead of making him clean shaven. It's okay to have Sarah J. Maas inspirations, totally fine. A lot of authors are inspired by other authors. That's always going to be a thing, forever and always. There's nothing that is so unique that we've never seen anything like it before, and anything that even borders on that often is seen as too weird. But it has to have a little bit more originality. It's okay to be inspired by her. I understand that in a lot of ways people look to her as sort of like the mother of fantasy romance. But we can do different things than just what she does. Next up, tall men and tiny women. That can be cute. It can be cute. It can also be cute when guys are not 6'5" at the minimum, and it can also be nice when women aren't like 5 feet tall at the maximum. You know, we can have heights in between these things. And we can also have characters that it's not like the love interest always has to be so different in height from the main character. People have different heights. And again, tall and short can be adorable. It can happen, and there's nothing wrong with it being in a book. But when it's this combined with everything else, or a lot of these other things, it's contributing to it feeling like the same old, same old. Ethnically ambiguous man. And I also put in parentheses, tan. Can we stop calling the love interests tan and then retroactively being like, no, he's a man of color. So if he's tan, it's probably because he was outside a lot, which ironically, some of these characters are tan and then they never seem to spend time outdoors. But regardless, the ethnically ambiguous male characters, there's a reason that every love interest, it feels like, in stories these days, if you look up fan art for one, that's fan art for all of them. People have different skin tones, and they can exist within stories, and they can be the love interests too. And hey, they can be the main characters also. And I think the reason that tan is so frustrating is because when authors try to retroactively say that a character is supposed to be a person of color, then write them in the language that would indicate that they're a person of color and not just a white person who was sun-kissed just the perfect amount. Next up, we have the alpha male. This is very similar to the males-females rhetoric, but what's funny is the alpha males in books are not the same thing as what we categorize as alpha males in real life, pretty much at all. Alpha males are closer in these books to being the doormat character who just happens to sometimes growl at the woman when they're filled with passion and really want to do them. And then suddenly it's like, oh, now he's an alpha. Like, he's an alpha in the bedroom, but the rest of the time he's like uber supportive and like, yeah, do whatever fits your fancy. Walk all over me if you need to, but in the bedroom, I rule that room. You know, like, that's the vibe. And in real life, it's like, women are second to the man.
They provide for us, and we must obey them because they are our masters.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with having characters that are very different in personalities or who want certain things, so long as everybody is on board with that within that relationship, that's fine. But it's just that there's so many different kinds of human beings that display different characteristics. We can just have more of a reflection of that in our characters. I think that would go such a long way. A minute ago, I was talking about how tall men and tiny women are a thing, and this next point is massive men, which I'm not referring to their heights. And that's all I'll say. These next two are not necessarily the same things, but they often result in very similar arcs or plots, and that would be amnesia and or hidden identity. So sometimes they're tied together in that the amnesia results in a hidden identity from the character themselves, or the character has a hidden identity and they know it, but it's a reveal later on in the story. This is something that is just really frequent in a lot of these, and I think this results in not just for how the arc plays out for the character, but with the love interest, it kind of has this, we don't have to work as hard for the characters to fall in love with each other because, oh, wow, I got my memories back and it turns out I used to really love you, so now I'm in love with you like that. And then you don't actually have to work to develop the love between the characters. For the last one, this is less so rooted in the characters themselves or these specific more romance-oriented tropes, but just this also contributes to things feeling really similar, if not almost borderline identical, and that would be the very underdeveloped worlds. So many fantasy readers truly are very open to reading fantasy romance, and we're not even necessarily expecting the most epic of fantasy worlds, because there's a lot of fantasy that's not considered fantasy romance. It's just considered fantasy, and it's not like there's that much world building involved. Sometimes there are books where there's no magic, there's not even really different races of beings or anything that you could point to and it's very obvious it's fantasy. It's just that it's a political structure that's different from ours and countries with a different history. So it's not like we're looking for the most epic and huge of proportions kind of fantasy world building. It's just that we want the world building to not be underdeveloped. We want it to serve a purpose and we want it to make sense, and it can be really cozy. It doesn't have to be anything spectacular. I think a book that really stands out to me, and this is more so like cozy fantasy / cozy fantasy romance, would be, and a lot of you know I really like it, and if you don't like it, that's totally fine, but The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. It's pretty much just, it's our own world, but there are witches that exist. That's it. It didn't need to have a whole lot else going on. That's all it really needed to serve the plot, which is that because witches keep their identities hidden, there are these 3 young orphan girls who happen to be witches, and the people that are her caretakers, are their caretakers, the individuals know that those 3 young girls are witches. They themselves, though, don't know anything about magic, so they're trying to find somebody who can teach these girls so that they don't accidentally reveal themselves one day and then put themselves in danger. And that's it. That's all you needed to know. And that worked for that book. There are instances, though, where we have these worlds that it feels as though very little is being put in because we're just allowing the reader to fill in the gaps based off of whatever other fantasy worlds we've read about. And then it's not like it's actually anything unique in the context of that story. And that's unfortunate because there are instances where the worlds do seem really cool, but because we're not developing them very much, then there's not a whole lot for readers to latch onto. And thus it makes readers question, why is this even fantasy? You could have written this story with contemporary and it probably would have worked a lot better. But anyway, that is it for a kind of concise-ish list of things that I have noted. You could categorize a lot of these as tropes or just things that occur, language that is used within books that is making it feel as though a lot of the books we're picking up feel very similar to each other. And I hope that, similar to what I said at the beginning, the way that fantasy kind of had to learn how to branch out of the Lord of the Rings inspiration and a lot of the tropes that came with that, I hope that we can start to see a lot of works that come out of these specific things as well. If you have your own recommendations for things that you think really utilize these tropes as best as possible, feel free to leave those recommendations. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.